Welcome to Think on These Things. My name is Gabriel Etzel, and I work with the School of Divinity here at Liberty University. This year for Think on These Things, we are walking through Scripture, both Old Testament and New Testament, in 2024. And so if you follow along with us in our reading plan, we will walk through all the chapters of Scripture. And so each week we're filming these videos to give a little bit of a recap of some of the chapters and just some observations that we see from the text. We thank you for joining us, and if you would like the reading plan, you can find that in the description below. We've been walking through the book of Genesis and through the book of Matthew, and so today what I want to do is talk specifically about the end of the book of Genesis. If you're like me, as you kind of sit back and kind of absorb this text, right? Read through this text, how God shows us, Genesis 1 through 11, kind of how we got here, the significance of humanity as the pinnacle of God's creation, how the nations came about, how God formed these nations, and then chapters 12 through chapter 50 in Genesis is really the story of one family and how God's working through this one family, how God has this covenant with Abraham. He renews it with Isaac. He renews it with Jacob. And then you kind of think in your mind, well, who's the next one person he's going to establish this covenant with or renew this covenant? But really, it's all of Jacob's children. So all of Jacob's children are children of the covenant. And as you continue to read through the Old Testament, you will see that all of those sons of Jacob are children of the covenant. There's going to be a lot of ups, a lot of downs, but God is true to the covenant itself. What I want to focus on, though, is really the last part of the last chapter of Genesis, which is Genesis chapter 50. We've had so many things within the life of Joseph that we've talked about or you've read about here in Genesis. And when you get to Genesis chapter 50, you have this really interesting interaction. Of course, Joseph himself had been sold into slavery, assumed to be dead probably by this point, certainly from his father who thought he was dead, but from his brothers even not knowing what had become of him. God worked through that and made Joseph second in command over all of Egypt. He was able to then not only help the Egyptians, but help the other nations of the world through this grain and other things that he had stored up during this in preparation for the famine. And so we see God working through Joseph's life and the whole nation itself ending up, or this people group at this point, about 75 or so people come down to Egypt and start living there. All of Jacob's son and Jacob himself. But in the midst of all this, we see here at the end of Genesis chapter 50 that Jacob dies. And when Jacob dies, the other brothers are afraid, well, maybe Joseph was just being kind to us while dad was still alive. And so they were very fearful. They go to Joseph, or they send word to him and basically are saying, please have mercy on us. And notice Joseph's response. This is an individual who had been sold into slavery by his brothers, had been deceived. Terrible things had happened to him. And notice what he says in Genesis chapter 50, verse 18. It says, his brothers also came, fell down before him, and said, behold, we are your servants. Verse 19, but Joseph said to them, do not fear. Am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. What a tremendous response. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know that I always respond that way. Joseph, who had actually the authority in Egypt to do pretty much whatever he wanted, he could have taken out vengeance on his brothers, and yet Joseph said, am I in the place of God? Now, take a step back even from that and say, how often do we wish that God would put us in a position where we could enact our own will? And yet Joseph was in that position, and he chose not to do that. He said, I'm going to be obedient to God. It reminds me of a definition of sin itself from a pretty standard theology text called Christian Theology from an individual named Millard Erickson. He defines sin as this. He says, simply stated, sin is failure to let God be God in placing something or someone in God's rightful place of supremacy. Essentially, sin is taking God off his throne and putting anyone or anything in God's place of throne or supreme over your life. Joseph had the opportunity to do that, and his answer, his response, his heart was, am I in the place of God? That's a tremendous thing for us to, I think, reflect on as we kind of recap the book of Genesis. The other part of his response then is saying, you meant this for evil, but God meant this for good. How often do we look back on life and say, we've gone through very difficult things, and maybe people really were out to get us. Joseph's brothers were out to get him. And yet he has the perspective that even though you meant it to harm me, God ultimately was working. So I want to ask you, I want to encourage myself even in this to say, how often would I take things into my own hands if I could? And how often do I not have this perspective that God is actually at work, even in the very difficult times? So throughout this week, please be encouraged by that as you read through the book of Genesis and as we start then into other books like Exodus, where there's a lot of things going on there as well, that we would say, I am not in the place of God. That is up to God to carry out whatever he wants to. And secondly, God is orchestrating things and God is working through, yes, sinfulness that is happening, but God can work that out ultimately for his glory and for my good. So be encouraged with that today. I know that I am as I reflect on these things in the book of Genesis and see the story of how God has worked through one family to bring about his glory. I want to thank you for joining us this week. I want to encourage you, if you have questions about the programs or the courses we offer through the School of Divinity, you can find a link to our website in the description below. And for the reading plan that we're going through, I encourage you to continue to do that on a daily basis. You can find the reading plan in the link below as well.